So I don't know about you, but I am particularly hung up on the trials and tribulations around the banking industry. Now, people, my colleagues tell me it's a badge of courage to suffer with that, but oh boy, I just don't get it. And our members have shared over and over again that they want Troy and we as the Arcview team to bring more and rich content to these forums, and that's what we're doing. So I am so proud to tell you that we're going to do a little piece right now on what the heck is going on in the banking industry. And I got to represent, along with some of my other Arcview members, Arcview at Lobby Days in Washington, D.C. in May. This was a fascinating experience. And because I knew somebody, I made my way to Pete Sessions' office. Pete Sessions, no relationship to Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, but equally a tough guy here. He is the head of the Rules Committee, I learned, and he is allowing no banking laws to even get to the floor for a vote. I was outraged by this. And so to continue this conversation, we have a terrific banking group. I welcome to the stage, listen to these magical, fabulous people. Jan Owen, who is California's Commissioner of the Department of Business Oversight. Peter Williams, who's Deputy General Counsel of California's Business Consumer Services, and Aaron Smith, who is the Executive Director of NCIA. And Aaron, I thank you for a very organized set of lobby days in DC. You and your team did a great job. I welcome you to the stage, and moderated by none other than Khurshid Khoja. You heard about Khurshid earlier. He is not only on the board of NCIA, but just a magnificent attorney and regulatory authority. I welcome you to the stage.
All right, well, I'm very pleased to be moderating this discussion on cannabis banking issues, what investors need to know. We're honored to be joined, as Jean mentioned, by three very distinguished panelists. The Honorable Jan Owen, Commissioner of the California Department of Business Oversight, Pete Williams, the General Counsel of the California Department of Business, Consumer Services, and Housing, and Aaron Smith, the ED of the National Cannabis Industry Association. Before we dive in, I wanted to give each of our panelists an opportunity to briefly discuss their connection to the cannabis banking issue and give you guys a greater context for their comments. So, Commissioner Owen, would you start, and then we'll have Pete and Aaron follow up.
Good afternoon. I'm Jan Owen with the California Department of Business Oversight. I regulate 368,000 licensees, banks, credit unions, mortgage companies. I'm the state securities regulator as well, so broker-dealers and investment advisors, payday lenders, escrow companies, and a total of 22 different types of licensees. If you'd have told me in 1966 that I, as a young adult, that I would be trying to figure out a way to bank cannabis, I'd have told you literally you were smoking something. It is truly my honor to work for an administration that believes and works very hard in trying to find a solution on banking. And I can talk for hours on this, so I'll pass it on to Pete, and we'll go from there.
So I'm the general counsel at the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. We oversee Jan's agency, but that's not to make it sound like I'm her boss. I don't know if anybody is Jan's boss. We also, I kind of exist at an interesting crossroads. Not only am I involved in some of the banking aspects of cannabis by way of overseeing Jan's shop, we also oversee the Bureau of Cannabis Control. So I've been involved in some of the regulation making there and some of the statutory changes that you've seen in the law. And so I'm sort of at, again, an intersection of a lot of the emerging issues that come with a new industry in a really big state.
Thank you for having me. I'm Aaron Smith, Executive Director of the National Cannabis Industry Association, which maintains the most established and robust lobbying operation on behalf of the cannabis industry, representing nearly 1,700 member businesses across the country. And as such, the banking issue has been central to our legislative priorities, resolving the banking issue literally since day one. This is an issue that has not only huge financial implications for the industry and those of you invested in the industry, but it's certainly a public safety issue and a challenge for regulators to be able to track transactions in a seed to sale system that is outside the banking system. So we commend all efforts to resolve this issue in the short term and in the long term through federal policy reform.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview. So let's dive in with a quick hypothetical. Imagine that you're attending an Arcview investor forum and you hear a pitch from a fantastic plant-touching startup located right here in California, the hottest and largest state market in the legal cannabis industry. You invest enthusiastically in the success of this startup, and many months later, the business is in the black and beginning to generate dividends for its investors. You take your first check to the bank from California Cannabis LLC, a fully licensed and legal cannabis company, pleased that you've made such a wise investment. The bank teller takes one look at the check from California Cannabis LLC and apologetically returns the check to you, saying that they cannot deposit it. What's worse, you get a letter the week after notifying you that your bank account will be closed at the end of the month, offering little to no explanation as to why. Unfortunately, this is not an unheard of fact pattern. So what just happened there, Pete?
So a lot just happened behind the scenes, obviously. So fun fact, I also used to be, I'm a former prosecutor, both at the state level and as a special federal prosecutor. What happened here was that a compliance officer for the bank probably talked to an attorney for the bank, and the attorney for the bank said, here's the problem with the check, is that it could implicate federal money laundering laws. So the important thing for people to know when they're going to deposit money from a cannabis business or a cannabis-related business is that those banks are complying with federal law. The state law now is not a problem. You can, under state law, you can bank cannabis money. It's the federal laws, as probably all of you already know this, that are the problem. And you'll hear a lot about the Bank Secrecy Act. The Bank Secrecy Act is simply the mechanism by which the bank is required to report to the federal government, hey, you just deposited a check from a cannabis business. That's not the hammer that you as a depositor is facing. The fear that you should have and the fear that the bank is having, and that's the reason why they returned your check, is the money laundering laws. And there's really two primary ones in the federal government, and that's the 1956 and 1957. And I won't get too far down in the weeds, but there's about 4 ways you can launder money under 1956. The one that cannabis businesses come up against is the promotion. It's called promotional money laundering, and that is if you are taking money from an illegal business, in this case a federally illegal business, and you are transacting it. You are making a financial transaction with that money. In this case, you're depositing it. You are engaged in money laundering. The reason being is that in theory, not in theory, you gave that business some startup cash to get it going, and now you are getting the dividends from it. So they might consider that a type of promotional money laundering. More commonly, it's the business itself goes to deposit its proceeds with the bank, its profits, perhaps its gross or net revenues, and then later on, it's taking money out to go buy more supplies, to pay its bills, to pay its employees. That's promotional money laundering. That promotes the illegal business. So To be clear, it is, again, you'll hear a lot about Bank Secrecy Act. I think generally speaking, at least here in California, we're okay with saying, hey, yes, we're a cannabis business, we're going to bank cannabis money. It's that triggers something with the federal government, and that's the money laundering laws. So that's a real broad overview of what's going on when the bank returns the check, and when it shuts down your account, it's looking at its liability, and it's mostly looking at its liability from the aspects of money laundering.
So clearly, it doesn't matter whether you're an operator or an investor, whether you're touching the plant directly or not. You're still going to fall under the same federal statute as far as the bank is concerned.
So strictly speaking, and from the most conservative view, I think the answer to that is yes. But every step removed, I mean, there has to be a connection. There has to be some kind of connection with the money you're putting into a bank and some promotional aspect of the business that you took the money from. That is, you're somehow helping that business. You're part of a circulating the money, or in this case, you gave money at the front end and now you're taking it out at the back end. These are novel concepts, Khurshid, because this is a novel situation. I mean, even in prohibition, where you had alcohol that was illegal on a federal level, it was also illegal on a state level. This is the first time, I think, in the history of the United States where we have had a product that is perfectly legal under state law but illegal under federal law.
So, Aaron, as head of the nation's preeminent cannabis trade association, I know NCIA is doing a lot of work in Congress to reform laws and to ensure that both cannabis businesses and investors have access to banking services. What should investors know about the efforts to reform federal law to allow banking access? What's NCIA working on?
Well, to look at the progress in Congress, you kind of have to step back and take a really long view, because Congress moves very slowly on everything, and that's kind of baked into our constitutional system. And then on top of that, we have cannabis, which is a somewhat controversial issue, but becoming less so. And NCIA first started working with members of Congress when we founded the organization in 2011, and then by 2013 had what is now called the Safe Banking Act introduced in the House, which was the first bill that would actually carve out a safe harbor under federal law, the money laundering laws, as well as the Bank Secrecy Act, for financial institutions that wanted to do business with the licensed cannabis industry or the ancillary businesses. And at that time, there was really hardly anybody knew about this issue on the Hill in DC. Certainly, hardly anybody wanted to touch the issue except for the handful of progressive Democrats from here in the Bay Area and places like Oregon and Washington, and some of the usual suspect libertarian Republicans that have supported the issue more broadly. But fast forward to now, that legislation on the House side now has almost 100 co-sponsors, so 20% of the House. It has strong bipartisan support. And then on the Senate side, there's now Senate legislation, which is a companion bill that has, last I checked, 17 co-sponsors. Also, great bipartisan support. And this issue is very, very difficult for even the opponents to argue against, because even if you don't think that cannabis should be legal, the reality is that it is. In most states, it's legal for medical use, and the writing is on the wall that state by state, this industry is expanding. You don't want to see this money outside the banking system. The challenge has been, as Gene said, the congressional leadership has blocked all legislation, all progress on any cannabis legislation and most legislation in general. So it's been very, very difficult to get a hearing, much less a vote on this issue, on the Safe Banking Act. We have looked at other possible vehicles to attach the provision to other must-pass bills. The only one that's kind of been floating out there is the repeal of the Dodd-Frank Act, but that's such a poison pill for our supporters on the Democratic side of the aisle that's probably unlikely. Another avenue that we've been pursuing to find some relief in banking, it would not change the statutes, which is ultimately what's needed, is through the appropriations process, limiting the spending authority from the Department of Treasury for sanctioning banks that are doing business with our industry. We've actually had a House floor vote on that 2 years ago, and it passed. At the time, unfortunately, we were unable to get the Senate Appropriations Committee to pass the same language, so it never passed into the budget. Congressman Sessions, the Rules Committee chair, has not allowed a House floor vote on appropriations amendments since. So we are in a situation where we know we have the majority, and that again was 2 years ago, we know we have the majority support of Congress, certainly the public, for reform, but it's congressional leadership that's holding this up. So as we go into the November election, we're seeing more and more mainstream support for not just banking reform, but broader marijuana policy reforms that would either defer federal policy to the policies in the states, like the States Act, which is introduced by Senator Gardner and Warren in Congress a couple months ago, that would essentially say if you're complying with state laws within a certain framework that are, some guardrails, you are essentially in compliance with federal law, and then therefore that would take care of any of the banking issues, 280E issues, and all the other issues related to the federal conflict. And then even further sweeping legislation has been introduced by the minority leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, which actually would legalize cannabis coast to coast and begin the path toward federal regulation. That's a much more far-sweeping bill, but we support all of these avenues for reform, and I think next year we have a great shot.
Thank you. Short of federal legislative change, we at least during the Obama administration, we had the Cole memo, we had the FinCEN guidelines. Attorney General Sessions has repealed the Cole memo. Technically, the FinCEN guidelines still are in place, so they fall under Treasury. Pete, as a former special prosecutor, can anyone take comfort in the fact that the FinCEN guidelines are still there and haven't been repealed or rescinded?
I'm trying to think of a short answer to that, and I think that I was trying to think of a short answer other than no. Banks are, at least in some senses, relying on the fact that the FinCEN memo still exists. The problem with the FinCEN memo is there's at least 4 or 5 different spots in the FinCEN memo that says, hey, banks, if you're interested in being on the right side of the federal government and you want to bank cannabis money, here's how you go about it, which is in and of itself a pretty remarkable document. But the problem there is that it cross-refers to the Cole memo at least 4 or 5 different times. We'll say, for instance, bank, if you see cannabis money coming in, presumably you're going to know your customer like no other customer, and if it implicates one of the Cole memo red flags, then you need to file what's called there's like 3 different cannabis suspicious activity reports that you can file, but depending on whether or not the money implicates a Cole memo guideline, it depends on how you're supposed to act under FinCEN. In other words, it's kind of a double-jointed document without one of the joints. I was also trying not to do any puns here, but I avoided that. I know that didn't work. So I guess again, the short answer is if you're a bank, and banks are generally conservative. They're handling other people's money. And if you're an attorney for a bank, you're going to be doubly conservative. The answer to your question is, unfortunately, no.
So obviously it's still extremely important to continue to push on the federal front for legislative change. Any kind of executive guidelines are not going to be sufficient, and certainly in this case, we shouldn't be relying on that as a short-term solution either.
I agree. At least when the Cole memo was in existence, that was a needle that could be threaded for particularly intrepid banks that want to bank cannabis money. Now that's gone.
Yeah. Jan, it seems like federal change is on the horizon from what Aaron's telling us. We have had significant support in Congress. Every year the number of co-sponsors gets bigger, but federal change is not imminent. And so can investors in California businesses at least fall back on existing state-chartered financial institutions for their banking needs? What guidance has the state offered to the state banks that would otherwise bank legal cannabis businesses in California?
So I'd like to give you some information. First of all, there's never been a bank or a credit union that has been closed down by a federal or a state regulator because they are banking cannabis, ever. My banks and credit unions that come to see me, I tell them that they are to look at this business model just like they look at any cash-intensive, uncertain, and risky business. It reminds me of gaming in California about 20, 25 years ago and some of the issues that we grappled with then. I also meet with my examiners who are out in the field with their banks, and they are seeing my banks banking cannabis, and they're not seeing any problems with it to date. Although that sounds very promising, I will tell you my banks in general have a problem complying with the Bank Secrecy Act. So when they are regulated or reviewed by the feds and you decide to bank cannabis, you need to be a clean Bank Secrecy Act shop. And many, many of my institutions aren't there. Are they getting there? Without question. But they're not there, and they still need stronger compliance teams. They need to work with the board of directors of their institution. The board of directors needs to understand that these institutions are banking cannabis and what that risk is.
And so even with state chartered institutions, there is still some federal oversight and involvement, right? Can you describe
Yes.
what that is roughly?
Yes, roughly it is, if you're, and this is getting into crazy arcane law, but if you're a state non-Federal Reserve Bank member, then you're licensed and chartered by me, and your insurer is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. If you are a member bank of the Federal Reserve, then you are licensed and chartered by me, but the Federal Reserve is your federal counterpart, along with the FDIC. And then if you have a holding company, you get the Federal Reserve again with the FDIC and us.
So it seems like there are definitely good reasons why California might want to consider a state alternative that's outside of the Fed system or somehow beyond the purview of federal regulators, whether it's the FDIC or the Fed. Put differently, would passing federal legislation automatically open the floodgates to banking access, or are there other factors that might lead to the industry continuing to be underbanked such that we should, at the state level, consider alternatives and push those? It's for either you or Pete.
You want me to take? I'll start with changing federal law. Means that they can change it back after a new administration. So institutions get nervous, and Pete said it, bankers, credit union execs are a conservative bunch of people. They want more certainty. Are they working very hard with Aaron and his team to try and get something done, but they want more certainty. Each institution will make their own choice of whether or not they want to bank cannabis or bank the industry. It happens like if they want to bank payday lenders, or if they want to bank, and I'm not equating it, I'm just using it as an example. Do they want to bank construction? Do they want to bank real estate? It's the same, they have to make the same risk assessment of the institutions. My department meets with anybody with a bright idea on how to bank cannabis. I will meet with anybody, I will meet with everybody. We've met in my office with over 80 different businesses that are looking to try and assist us in California. We have done legal analysis, and we hope to try and figure out if there was a way to do this. And many of you, and I'm sure in this room, have heard about SB 930. SB 930 is Senator Bob Hertzberg's attempted to try and get some banking parameters that interested institutions could use, as well as have participants. It has some challenges because although it is what we call a closed loop system, there's not a way to get that money or that value out of that closed loop system and into the banking system. How do you pay your rent check? How do you pay your utility check? We continue to work with Senator Hertzberg. One of the issues, as you know, is what everyone will tell you: you need an ABA routing number or you need a master account, which are the same thing, and that needs to be approved by the Federal Reserve or by the feds. And there has not been one approved yet to date.
Pete, anything to add on either SB 930 or the problem of sort of private regulation of these accounts in terms of the willingness to take on new industries?
So if for instance, there was a federal carve-out for like the Safe Banking Act, for instance, your original question was, would there be floodgates opened here in the state of California? Touches on a couple different things. A lot of people think, well, gosh, Wells Fargo will come in, Bank of America will come in, and they'll take over the cannabis banking industry. Hard to say if that's true or not, because those banks have reputational concerns that they're also interested in. They bank billions and billions of dollars from other industries who may or may not be comfortable with working with a bank who also banks cannabis. That's just a fact. Again, these are conservative boards of directors and so forth. So there's a reputational issue, at least with respect to the larger banks. I think for some of the credit unions, perhaps community banks, I think you'll see a lot more coming forward. But again, now you have to deal with what Jan said, which is the regulatory aspect of it. You can't be a bank that's got 50% of their accounts are cannabis accounts, 50% of their assets are cannabis. FDIC won't allow that. The Fed's not going to allow that. You can't Jan's shop's not going to allow that. You can't concentrate all of your business in one industry, particularly a high-risk, cash-intensive one like cannabis. So those would be some additional concerns. Would it be a good thing if the federal government had a carve-out? You better believe it, in terms of being able now to have a safe place for cannabis businesses to put their money. Will it be a tsunami of activity? Probably not, at least not initially, until I think people see more how the landscape develops. That's my prediction, for whatever that's worth.
Sure.
And what the DOJ does, right? The Department of Justice. What will happen, say that without an appropriation change, well, how's the Department of Justice going to look at this in their districts? Northern California Eastern District has McGregor Scott. He was just appointed. He was George W. Bush's pot czar. That's a concern.
Of course. So, Aaron, just to come back to the appropriations issue, how likely is it that we're going to see an appropriations bill in the future, the 2019 bill perhaps, that actually does address adult use and binds the U.S. DOJ from prosecuting not only operators but also potentially banks that are seeking to bank the industry?
Everything hinges on the election. So I think that if we continue to have a Republican majority on the House side anyway, it's going to be very unlikely that we'll get any appropriations writers on cannabis or any other issue. It's also the Paul Ryan's rule over Congress has had this mandate that there would be no earmarks. And part of earmarking, that process that allows the earmarks, is also the same process we use to get appropriations riders introduced from the House floor. So I don't think we're going to see the opportunity to have floor votes as long as, and even committee votes, as long as we are dealing with a Republican majority on the House. That said, I think we actually, even with a Republican majority, I think we would be more likely to see in the coming year or two more comprehensive legislation like the States Act before we would see the incremental legislation like the Safe Banking Act. I think that that's probably at this point, as momentum is at our backs, and we now have the president said that he's likely to support the States Act. We have a growing majority in Congress on both sides of the aisle, like that members of Congress that are fighting to make this their issue going into the midterms. I think we have a good shot at more comprehensive reform. But if the Democrats take the House, we'll definitely have a lot of opportunities for hearings, opportunities for floor votes on this issue and many others. And while NCIA is a nonpartisan organization, it's hard for me not to acknowledge that on stage that Republican leadership in Congress is our biggest challenge. And so get involved in the elections here and engage those members of Congress who support this issue and support them back.
Well, we're about a minute away from lunch, and I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to offer any parting thoughts that you have for our audience. Jan?
Come and see me if you have a bright idea. Please. Sign up.
Pete, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose kind of echoing something that Aaron said, which is it does kind of feel like we're close to a tipping point. And again, predictions are just that, they're predictions, but when you have the majority of the people in the United States that favor having legalized cannabis, it really, to me, just seems like it's a matter of time, and I don't think I'm unique in having that particular view.
We're down to 30 seconds, but since it's you, Bobby, go ahead.
The question is, many people in our circles are working on blockchain. How do we facilitate that so it becomes a viable system that works for the cannabis industry, for the banking industry, for our economic and U.S. Global interests?
I think we have a panel for the next Arcview conference now. How do we address the application of blockchain?
So may I?
Sure, please.
Ask your regulator to come help you as you start to look at that. We are looking at blockchain as well as a potential solution. Candidly, I'm training my staff on what blockchain is, because that's part of the issue as well, right? What is blockchain? People kind of. So we would be very interested in being part of that discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time for our session, but thank you so much to our panelists for taking time from their very busy schedules to join us. Let's give them a hearty round of applause. And thank you all very much.